Yes. I would like to use my 20 minutes to discuss the role of public policies and markets in producing crisis. By the crisis, I mean a deep breakdown in the economic activity. The popular cliché is that it is the capitalism or markets, especially financial markets, which produce this crisis. And this sort of belief has been strengthened and propagated after the recent, what is called global financial crisis. But it's largely empirically wrong. Why? The first point, if you compare various regimes, then you notice that the deepest crisis has happened not in the market economies, but in non-market economies, especially under socialism. By socialism, I mean a system where private property is banned. As a result, you have an extreme concentration of political power. And look at experience. The worst crisis happened under socialism, but they are not called crises. What has happened under Stalin in the 30s, it was an economic crisis associated with genocide. What has happened under Mao in the 50s and the 60s, it was a genocide plus a very deep economic crisis. 50 million people were dead. What about Khmer Rouge, Red Khmers in Cambodia? Grave crisis plus genocide. I am not saying that every case of socialism was like that. I am saying that when you have an extreme concentration of political power, then there is a risk that some psychopaths would come to this power. And then having this power, they can make extreme destruction. So the lesson is limit political power. And if you limit political power, then you enlarge the freedoms. This is the reverse side of the coin. We find many less drastic examples of very wrong policies under heavy concentration of political power. What about Khrushchev? He went to the United States, was impressed by corn cultivation and wanted all of the Soviet Union to be covered by corn. It was a catastrophe. What about Fidel Castro? He came to the conclusion that the only salvation for Cuba was to increase the cultivation of sugarcane, a catastrophe. What about the policies in Poland in the 70s, in Romania, to increase the public debt in a vain hope of then modernizing the still socialist economy? Only the first stage was implemented, increase the public debt. The second stage could not be implemented under socialism, because you cannot modernize economy under socialism or under Putinism. You cannot have top-down modernization of the economy. So the first point to remember, it is not the markets which have produced the deepest crisis. It is the excessive concentration of political power. The second empirical observation would refer to what we call capitalism of Western type. It differs. And it is here that most critics of capitalism focus on. There is a myth, still popular in the West, that Great Depression in the 30s was a definite proof that capitalism failed. And there is one man, Keynes, who rescued single-handedly. And frankly, Delano Roosevelt. They saved capitalism. Well, what is the truth? I think it was shown empirically by Milton Friedman and Arnold Schwartz that the stock market crash in 1929 was turned into deep recession by wrong monetary policy conducted by a public institution, which was and is called Fed. And then policies which were pursued have perpetuated this. They started under Hoover, and they continued under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. For example, they wanted to increase demand by raising wages. So they suppressed profits, and they limited investment. And they increased protectionism. So the lesson from the Great Depression is rather that bad policies produce very bad results. and not free markets, including the financial markets. And let us look at the recent crisis. First of all, not every country has suffered a crisis, so differences in national policies matter. In the Eurozone, on the one hand, you had Greece, Spain, Italy. On the other hand, there was Germany, so far, not yet a sick man of Europe, pretty healthy, so differences. Second, I think it is useful to distinguish, while speaking about the recent crisis in some countries, to distinguish between two types of a crisis depending on their sequence. The first one I called fiscal to financial crisis. And the second one, financial to fiscal crisis. So the sequence is different. In the fiscal to financial crisis, the problems start with accumulating public debt. And the most spectacular example has been Greece. Increasing spending financed by, as I said, accumulated public debt, sooner or later leads to a breakdown, and then everything goes into the reverse. So you have a crisis in the financial sector, which is not produced by the financial sector, but by the policies. You have a crisis in the fiscal sector. And what is the sequence? Well, the fiscal crisis produces or contributes to financial crisis for the simple reasons that these are the financial institutions lend to the government. So when government lends itself in problems, financial institutions suffer. So because of the de facto bankruptcy of the Greek government, there was de facto bankruptcy of the Greek banks. And the second type of the recent crisis, the financial to fiscal crisis, has a reverse sequence. It starts with a boom in the financial sector, usually focus on the housing credit, and at least some booms turn into the bust. So there is no bust without the previous boom. What produces the boom? There's a lot of ideological disagreements about that, but I think there's ample evidence about the big role of wrong policies, which increase the demand and the supply of credit. And these bad policies have been well identified. I myself was a member of the de la Rosière group. Mr. de la Rosière is a former governor of the French bank, and we worked 4 years ago. We identified many wrong policies which have contributed to the credit boom, and credit boom turns bust. One very important item are excessively low interest rates which are kept for a long time. This was the Fed error. The second one was to start bailing out big banks, which started in Europe, I think, in the West some 50 years ago. So when you start this procedure, you distort the incentives and perceptions in the financial markets, because the lenders come to the conclusion that it is less risky to lend to big banks than to smaller banks, because big banks, if they run into trouble, are going to bail out. So the risk premium is reduced. By the way, many people blame the markets for the consequences of the distortions produced by the policies. Market behavior can be distorted by wrong policies, excessive risk-taking. So you have to look at the policies which distort the behavior of the market participants. Tax regulation. In many countries, they favor debt versus the equity. So it pays to incur debt. There are very popular regulations to finance, policies to finance mortgage credit. It is very good political sell. You sell cheap credit, cheaper credit. And there are many other regulations which have been identified. The lesson is that don't buy this very cheap story that whenever financial market produces the boom, it is because of the financial markets. So you have to do something about financial markets. It is a very primitive logic. and very popular. It is like saying, since sneezing occurs in the nose, the reason for the sneezing is the nose. The same logic. But many people are led to believe in that. So you have to look around the nose to identify the reasons. And as I said, there are many policies which have led to the crisis, and they have been very well researched. Only the problem is with communication. To communicate, one has to be, I think, very clear to unmask wrong policies. Now, I would finish ahead of my time by saying something which perhaps is a bridge to the next panel about financial regulations. There has been a lot of new financial regulations. But what is the net result? Can we be sure that there would be no repetition of next crisis? Well, I'm afraid we can't be sure. Why? First, not all wrong regulations have been scrapped. There were many wrong regulations. For example, there were and are still in existence regulations which encourage the banks to lend to the sovereigns on the assumption that lending to the states is not risky. So lending to Greek government was not risky. And there are four other regulations which give privileges to lending to the government, and they are still in force. Second, everybody agrees that one should end with too big to fail syndrome, meaning that when big financial institutions run into trouble, they should not be bailed out by the tax people. They should be resolved in an, as I said, orderly manner. And a lot of effort has been put into devising these procedures. But the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. So we'll see when the first financial institutions run into the crisis, whether it would be a good practice to resolve it. I think it's too early to say. Third, I think there are too many regulations which try to regulate the conduct, including regulations which aim at reducing what is called excessive salaries and wages in the financial sector. This is the envy politics, and they do not touch upon the fundamentals. And I think the fundamentals are in a corporate governance, in the institutional nature of the big banks, where responsibility has been too much reduced. So perhaps we should limit the limited liability. Limit the limited liability. Go back to good institutional solutions which have been present in 19th century, and change the incentives so that the bankers are more prudent in their own interest. Reduce a generous deposit insurance, especially with the big depositors, because if you have a very generous deposit insurance, you remove one source of market discipline. There is a gap, and who fills in the gap? Official hierarchical supervision. I was a supervisor, so I'm not saying this is always bad, but I know that there are limits to the efficiency of supervision. There are limits, informational limits, motivational limits. So one should reduce, I think, all those regulations which crowd out market discipline, market monitoring, etc. Increase one regulations which I think heads in appropriate direction is to increase capital requirements. This to some extent would mimic what was present under more free market conditions in the past. So, summing up, first, it is not the markets which produce the deepest crisis. It is the excessive concentration of political power. Second, even in the market economies, regarding the crisis, you have to look to the wrong policies as a root cause of the deeper crisis and not just blame the markets. And third, most importantly, if you want to reduce the frequency or scope of wrong policies, you have to monitor the politicians much more carefully and efficiently. And this is why events like that and associated think tanks are very important. Thank you very much.